Welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm Patrick, the CEO of Sano Genetics, and I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Mahsa Shabani today. Dr. Shabani is a researcher at the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Law at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Her research work focuses on data sharing and involvement of patients in research, particularly in genomics research recently. So I'm very excited to have her on the show today. She recently put out a paper about how participants can be ethically remunerated for sharing data and research studies. So we're going to talk a lot about that today, but we'll see where the conversation goes. So Mahsa, it's really great to have you on the show.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really happy to be with you today.
Of course. So just to get started, would you mind giving me a quick background of how you got into this field in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So this has been indeed a kind of extension of the research that I've been doing in the last couple of years, starting from my master thesis and then my PhD, which was really based on the importance of access to large-scale genomic data, which is seemed to be very important because we know that we really need to have access to large-scale genomic databases in order to improve the interpretation of the results. And this has been indeed in the recent years took this turn that so technology is getting cheaper and cheaper, so we can really sequence more individuals now, but still the interpretation is lagging behind. And some part of the problem is related to the fact that these data sets are indeed stored in silos, and not all researchers have access to the data sets from the other researchers. So this means that still there are very indeed significant hurdles in front of the researchers and also clinicians to have access to such genomic data.
So for people who aren't familiar with it, would you mind giving an overview of what are the largest genomic data sets out there and who has access to them, I guess to the best of your understanding?
Yeah, so basically you know that like every year there are many research groups are indeed receiving funding, for example, from all these big funding organizations like NIH or in the EU from the European Commission. So they can actually, and indeed there are so many resources for developing really so many different scales of genomics studies. And of course, some of them are more familiar for some people because they are mostly also set up in the population level. Some of the very recent ones are, for example, All of Us project in the US, or the H3 Africa, which is more really based on the data from the African continent indeed. And also some very famous examples, for example, in the UK, is like the UK Biobank project, or 100,000 genome project, which was organized by the Genome England. So these are the really very famous ones, but it's not really just limited to this. These are mostly more known because they are more like larger scale projects. But of course, like researchers in all these different universities, different research settings, and also in the private entities, they are indeed busy with the different sets of genomic studies. So, and the consequence is that they are actually generating genomic data and relevant indeed health data on a daily basis.
Right. And so I guess you mentioned three kind of big publicly funded projects, and those have, on the scale of the UK Biobank, has about 500,000 people.
Yes.
All of Us in the US is planning to enroll about 1 million people or over 1 million people. I think they've done 100,000 tests so far. But
yes.
Then maybe the elephant in the room is the direct consumer genetic testing companies, right? Like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, that have an order of magnitude more than that, 8 to 10 to 15 million, depending on who you ask, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Just the way of all these, the nature of probably the service is just a bit different in the
Right.
to the direct-to-consumer companies, because actually the consumers pay to indeed buy these kits and to receive this service. But as a consequence, all these, of course, direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies are able also to, develop databases based on the consumers' data.
Right. And I guess maybe this is a great segue into your most recent paper. I think it's the most recent one. It only came out
Yes, that's true.
And in the paper you talked about, so there are tens of millions of people who've been tested by direct consumer genetic testing companies. Now there are a number of startup companies that have come up allowing people to monetize that data. So you can download your data from 23andMe, for example, and upload it to a number of different places who ostensibly will help you sell that data to researchers. And in the paper, you kind of go through some of the ethical concerns with these models, or how, ethical concerns that might develop. I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of that.
Sure, yeah. So in this paper, which I wrote it together with my excellent master's student, Iman, we looked at these recent initiatives that they are kind of starting from this point that, well, if as a consumer of all these companies, you are actually, first of all, you are paying for the test, but at the same time, you are just making it possible for those companies to actually benefit from your data. So why not we think indeed about a new different model of business model, let's say, which hopefully at the end will result in making all these data sets more accessible for the different research purposes, for example. So as a result, we've seen that indeed there are, of course, this is very new in a sense. I think it's really just a couple of years ago, this has been started with a number of initiatives like Nebula Genomics or Luna DNA. These are some of the examples that they argue that it should be a model in place that would let the individuals who have access to their own sequence data, which they get it from the different sequencing or data consumer testing companies, they should be able to indeed, in a sense, control this data. And that's also a keyword there. And to be able to make it accessible to different interested parties, but at the same time to indeed set in place some incentives mechanisms, or let's say motivations for such individuals. That in return to sharing their data or making their data accessible to interested companies or researchers, to be able also to receive some rewards.
And so the central ethical challenge that it seems like you identified here is so there are these companies that are offering to remunerate people in a marketplace for their genetic data, and I suppose it's about why people are choosing to participate, right? If the financial reward is so high that people might be coerced into participating, then there are ethical issues. But if it's, maybe if it's small enough, or if the motivation is primarily altruism or something else, how do you think about those two pros and cons and weighing them up practically?
Exactly. So, I mean, if you look at the whole discussion about research ethics in general, which is not new, always the topic of giving monetary incentives in the conventional research setting has been a sensitive issue. And indeed, this is mainly because there is indeed the concern that this may unduly influence the research participants, and they may actually decide to participate not necessarily based on really informed decision, but under the influence of receiving these indeed monetary incentives, let's say. But of course, when it comes to, so we've been previously thinking more in the conventional research setting, right? It was more also thinking about more like an interventional or more invasive research type, that they had more physical harms of implications for the individuals that they were taking part in the research. But now we are really speaking about more of a kind of a data donation, if you will, or more like participation based on just sharing their data or giving access to their data.
So right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say I suppose the traditional way of thinking about it was often patients were being reimbursed for their time or for going to a lab, like you say. But when it becomes, you click a button and share it, then the value of the data is kind of decoupled from people's time, right? So how much is our data actually worth, or is it really clear? Did you look at this in your research?
Yeah, so basically, as I mentioned again, these are the initiatives that they are just starting, and I'm not sure even all of them have a very clear idea that how they are going actually to evaluate the value of these data sets, because you can easily also argue that these data sets, if they have been put together, so we are speaking about larger scale genomic studies, we are really speaking about hundreds and thousands of data sets. They're valuable. But what if we just talk about really one small data sets from each individual? Does it really still valuable if we really look at it in that way? So this is, yeah, so I think that what is being indeed tried so far has been really thinking about different ways of rewarding. And one of them, which I think that it will more take off, probably it's more like really just kind of offering free sequencing in exchange for data. So,
right.
Yeah, this is what I see that, for example, it's more likely that's going to happen.
I see. So rather than actually paying people, then you work out a sweet spot where researchers fund the cost of sequencing. But what then would happen after someone, because you only need to be sequenced once, right? From that point, would you sort of give access to researchers, give access to your data indefinitely, or?
Well, the thing is that also, although sequencing data, it's in itself, it's interesting and valuable for the researchers, but it's also more interesting when you couple it with more health-related data. So for that reason, it's more interesting for these companies or researchers to also to keep this, let's say, data collection relationship with individuals in a long, period. And from time to time, for example, ask them to fill out some questionnaires and then, just provide more information about their lifestyle and health-related information and medical history. So I think it's naive to think that it will be just limited to the one-time just sequencing data.
There, on a similar topic, there are a lot of healthcare systems like the 100,000 Genomes Project or Genomics England here in the UK that are starting to think about how they can make use of the incredible amount of data that they have and commercialize it in a way that feeds money back into the national healthcare system or into the Department of Health. There's same thing going on in several healthcare systems in the US. I imagine there might be examples in Belgium as well. What are your thoughts on this model? And it's a little bit different because there's often no patient in the loop. They've donated their data in a sense by participating in the healthcare system long ago.
Yes. So basically, there are so many different issues that they play a role when there are some plans for such commercializations of the indeed research data. I think one of the problematic aspects of this endeavor is that sometimes it comes as a surprise for the patients or the individuals. So this is something that they were not expecting that's going to happen. And this is sometimes collides with this idea of, so if you are indeed part of this bigger research project, this is going to eventually, for the public benefit. So, and now we are speaking about this partnership, and there are some always, let's say, it's concerns that what would be the final, indeed, the implications for for this public funded research, because there are some kind of indeed misgivings when commercial parties are involved in the biomedical research. So what indeed can help there, it's definitely, it's really transparency. It's in a sense that you really need to explain very well that what are these plans, how would be the final, let's say, benefit sharing between these different parties that they are involved in such a partnership. But of course, again, it just brings to the fore the question about that how much individuals can still keep control on their data.
Right. I think the 100,000 Genomes Project in Genomics England is actually a really good example of doing it right, like you described, because they have a very clear consent form and patients have to opt in to share. It's not like other cases where, you've basically you're just part of the healthcare system, and at some point in the past you've consented, and therefore people have access. So I think I agree with you that I see this as a really good model going forward.
Yeah. So, but it's also foreseen that in many of the countries that they have universal healthcare system. So it means that it's often sometimes at least the consent model is opt-out as well. So it means that when you are indeed being admitted to the hospital, so it's it's kind of expectation that your data can be used for the scientific research purposes. But of course, you are also aware that you are kind of trusting those institutions in a sense that you know that they have also some mechanisms in place that they make sure that this research is going to eventually be in the interest of the public benefit. So it's more than consent probably. It's
right.
Also just
And it needs to be ongoing in some sense, right? That it's you're consistently aware of what's happening and you're able to make choices and evolve over time, right?
Yes, yeah. Of course, this is something that is always, you have this ongoing, let's say, relationship with the places that you go and you receive your healthcare services, and of course, you want to make sure that all this data that's been collected and increasingly through the different devices, through different ways, it will be used in a way that it doesn't upset you.
I was wondering, you mentioned this in the paper, and I think it's topical because there was recently an amazing story about it in the NHS here in the UK, but you mentioned in the paper some questions around how we deal with genetic data from family members. So a few weeks ago, there was a story of a woman whose father was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, and he asked his doctors not to share that data with his daughter, not to share the diagnosis with the daughter. And now she's, I believe, suing the NHS because she felt that they had a duty to tell her that she was at risk, and she was, I believe, pregnant at the time. So how does that fit in, and how do you think about some of these really challenging issues?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Always, it's an ongoing discussion when we are speaking about genomic data, that how far you can really consider this data as really purely individual data, because we know that it has implications for the family members and blood relatives. And of course, also we sometimes also think about more like also the implications for the ethnic groups that, that such studies can, for example, just draw some conclusions that has some implications for them. So this is indeed, again, poses another question when it comes to the discussion about managing your genomic data or sharing your genomic data. That the question here is that how far you can really just leave this decision to the individuals. How far do you really need also to discuss that, for example, they have to consult, or they have to at least discuss their decisions about how they are going to share their data with their relatives, for example, because it has also some implications for them. But of course, here I think we are a little bit short of the, let's say, approaches or safeguards that they can help us to make this decision as really a joint decision between the individuals and their family members. Even, still there's a question that should they do that? Is it really still can be considered as individual data? But if our answer is positive to that question, that they have to indeed discuss it with the family members, then often there is a question of how this is going to happen. And we see that, for example, it has had some more obvious implications in for example, the case of Jet Match last year, that indeed police could solve some cold cases of from the crime scene because they could actually upload this data on some genealogy databases, and they could find indeed the suspect or the person that indeed committed the crime through their, I think, third cousin or so on. So it was basically, this happened because a distant family member actually shared their genetic data online on an open access database. So it was, of course, it was a very, let's say, maybe a very extreme case in a sense, but in general, it just shows that how we are indeed sharing this information that's coming from our genomic information with our relatives.
Right. And what do you see as the primary concern on both sides? So if we take the the Golden State Killer and
Mm-hmm.
all of the subsequent uses of publicly available genetic data to basically triangulate in on these cold cases. One side of the argument, it feels like, is saying it's so obvious we're catching, cold case murderers.
Yes.
We need to be using this. But the other side, it seems like, is arguing towards a slippery slope that, yes, it makes sense in this specific case, but giving unfettered access to this level of individual data will certainly be misused in the future. How do you see that debate playing out? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you said, that it always starts with some, at least in the Golden State Killer case, we were very, somehow obvious that, okay, it was for a good cause and it was really serious crime was involved. And why not? It helped the police to come into conclusion in that case. But of course, then the immediate second question is that where we are going to stop, because it actually helped the police in other cases that they were much less serious, indeed, crimes. And then you start to think that, okay, are we moving from the point that we say, oh, this can help occasionally police in solving some very serious crimes, to the point that, well, we can actually consider as one way that can be indeed used as a default option in the police investigation. So then the next probably step would be, then why not to actually develop these databases in a more systematic way, rather than just really relying on a random, referring to some of the available databases. So it's always, I think, is a question of where we are starting and where we are going to end, and whether or not this indeed the potential indeed in way that we will be ending up, it's desirable or not, both from the ethical perspective and also its implications for society in general.
Right. And I guess the vast majority of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies have said very publicly that they won't allow data to be used for this purpose. But there is one very large public database that has more or less embraced it, right? So, but I suppose the way the math works and the way you can triangulate people based on distant relatives, that you don't need that many people in a database. If you have, upwards of 1 million people, then you can start to identify almost anyone in the US, for example, with pretty reasonable certainty.
Yes, and plus that, I think for the law enforcement purposes, I think they can resist to some extent, but I'm not sure that always they can really make a good case if there is an official, for example, request to have access to these databases.
Right, so they can say we're not going to give it up willingly, but if they get a court order, then...
Yes. Yeah.
Have there been any examples, public examples of this happening, or is it something that they wouldn't then disclose publicly?
Well, that's indeed something that, because in another paper that hopefully will come soon, we actually looked at the policies and practices of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, and also some of these genealogy databases, to see that how actually they are dealing with this issue. And you see that they actually take different approaches, that from one view that they are indeed promising that they will resist, and if there is such a request, they would try to communicate this or just give some notice, for example, that there is such a request, to the point, to the other approaches that they are more indeed willing, that if there is indeed such a good cause, let's say, that and it's for public interest, then they would be willing to disclose the data. But if you follow this discussion, which mostly focus on some of these genealogy databases, like family tree DNA and also GEDmatch, we see that every couple of days, sometimes there is a new indeed case or development that indeed receives a lot of also public attention. That whether or not this is really
every couple of days there's a new.
Well, it depends how you are sensitive to this topic. Sometimes I think that this is really changing fast, and especially I think for a period also I was observing that they were changing their policies also quite often. And it was mostly just showing that they are responding to indeed to cases that's happening, and they want to accommodate, for example, this potential.
I guess it's hard to have this discussion without talking about blockchain as well. And it's something that you've written about, and it's a word that people often comes to mind today when we start talking about these issues of privacy and ownership and who has access. What are your thoughts on blockchain as a potential enabling solution to this? And maybe if you could just give a kind of brief overview of what a blockchain is, or what the class of technology is, if people aren't super familiar with it.
Yes, yeah. So the idea that indeed we also were interested to include this in our paper, and it was also another short paper that I wrote last year. It was coming from this fact that, well, we know, I mean, it is also very controversial, and some people, they really consider all this technology as really hype, and they don't see that this is indeed going to take off. But the idea that indeed made it really interesting for me, that don't have any background in ICT technologies, but more from the ethics and law, was indeed coming up with this more like technological solution to the problem that we are dealing in, mostly the governance of the data sharing or data control. And the idea was that, well, why not think about really a decentralized or indeed a system which would allow indeed different blocks, let's say, to be part of this platform, but we won't have any centralized indeed block to manage access to this database. So this was really a general idea about blockchain. And the idea is that this is really also increasing transparency in a sense, because all these transactions on these platforms are indeed, you can just record them on all these ledgers, and also it's very difficult actually to indeed in a very simple way to hack this system, let's say. So we are really increasing also in a sense let's say the security of these platforms. And so why not to use the same technology for such a sensitive, to management at least of such sensitive data when it comes to the genomics, and let also the different let's say parties that are interested to be part of this management of data access, to be part of this indeed platform, rather than just limiting it to the researchers to control who can have access to data for which purposes, which obviously it's not really working very well.
Right. Yeah. It's a hard problem to solve, isn't it? I suppose my thoughts on blockchain specifically is that it's a really interesting class of technology, but I feel that people are underestimating how challenging it is to make that work as a solution for this problem. And I think a lot of people have imagined that it can be used as a way to, as you mentioned, a decentralized way of storing and controlling access to data. But what it seems like most companies have done that initially launched as a blockchain company has been to use the blockchain for rewarding people to participate, so paying them for their data, but not so much as a storage or access mechanism, because I think that part is a lot harder probably than initially imagined to get it to work within the complexity. As you mentioned earlier, the healthcare data ecosystem is so complex and data is siloed in all sorts of different places, and it's hard enough to do this analysis on conventional software. So to bring something else in adds another layer of complexity.
Plus that you cannot really, when we are speaking, for example, about genomic data, we are speaking about really a very large volume of data that it's just pragmatically, it's not really possible to really store this on-chain. So, and of course, this is, again, we are speaking about very sensitive data. That's probably another, indeed, point to considerations, or another part of the problem, because you know probably that also after the indeed, I mean, we always had some data protection regulation in place, but now after the implementation of the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, we are even more indeed concerned about processing such sensitive data, which health data is part of it. So we really need to really make a convincing case that the technology that we are using is really compliant with all these regulations that are in place.
Right. So looking forward, I guess, in 10, I don't know how long you think it is, but 10, 15, 20 years, if the majority of the population has had their DNA sequenced, what predictions can you make for the future, or maybe what ethical challenges that we haven't thought much about today will emerge in the future in this world where potentially we're all genome sequenced from birth, for example?
I think one thing that I see that is coming is that it's this rhetoric of discussion about individuals should actually have control on their data. So it's really we are just moving from that indeed image that we had researchers that they were in charge, they were the only ones that actually arranged this type of genomic research, that so they could actually say we can have access to raw data, for example, or not. We are really moving in a direction that more and more individual, first of all, they have these possibilities to receive their individual genome sequencing, but also I think there is more interest from their side as well to be able to be indeed to somehow to keep control on who can have access to these databases and with whom they want to share it. So now the question then is, which I think that was a kind of the probably initial ideas of like using blockchain, was that do we have actually some governance tools or mechanisms in place to enable individuals to be part of this governance? And especially I think this is really probably urgent question for more population-based genomic studies, that they are indeed, now they are collecting data, but they somehow also want to involve individuals in this process of the governance. But always they are a little bit of short of really tools and mechanisms to be able to make this happen.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it does seem like it's changing, certainly little by little. There are great examples. I mentioned Genomics England and the 100,000 Genomes Project. They have a lot of patient involvement in the way that decisions are made at the highest level of the organization. I think one thing that I would really like to see is, as you say, more technology enablement to really put patients in the driver's seat of what happens with their data, what research they're able to participate in. Because I think at the moment we've kind of moved from people being considered research subjects, which nobody likes that word today. Now maybe research participants, and hopefully in the future something more like research partners, or moving closer to equal representation rather than a kind of patriarchal or top-down system.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit of more like really thinking about the real involvement of the patient. And of course, this is always, the interest is higher among patient groups because they actually want actively to be part of this process. I think this is something that is now somehow missing, that we really need to think that how we can actively really improve that. But of course, the other thing is that so far we always thought about some type of misuses that can happen to our data. I mean, we are all like, somehow we are leaving our electronic, let's say, footprint by just using all these different applications and, just Googling,
right, everywhere.
Yes, everywhere, yeah, of course. But I remember that probably 5-6 years ago when I was just looking at this topic, it was not always very obvious that, for example, what type of harm can be inflicted on me if for example, my health data are being compromised. Right. But now I think that it's more and more the case that maybe awareness are being a little bit, sometimes people are more aware that indeed they have to somehow protect also their sensitive data, including their health data. Of course, now that we are seeing that all these big companies, I think it was a couple of days ago, it was involvement of Amazon and all these big companies and their interest in health data. So this is also something that I'm very interested to see that how this is going to take shape, that knowing that there is somehow some kind of mistrust now, or like at least concern about potential misuse of data. But at the same time, there is more and more from the individuals that they share a lot from their health data, or their, indeed, just generally their personal data on the internet. So it's a tough,
Yeah, no, wonderful. I mean, I think there are kind of a few converging themes of patient centricity and control and ownership of data, but also healthcare systems and companies fully realizing the value of the data they have. Although I think, as you mentioned earlier, it's important to note that it really is only valuable at a certain scale and depth of data. There's not really an example of a company buying a single person's DNA. They're really transacting in large volumes. So we have to think about group level ethics as well as individual level ethics.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Well, wonderful. Thanks. I think we covered a lot of ground in terms of recent events and ethics. Is there a place that people can keep track of you and your work? I know you're on Twitter and you have a website. If they Google Mahsa Shabani, they could check out your Leuven website. Do you want people to follow you on Twitter or?
Yes, yeah. So I'm on Twitter, and I actually recently moved to University of Ghent. So
right.
now I'm
Great.
Yes, yeah. So now I work in now more specifically on privacy law issues. So yeah, and my papers and so on are often also available on ResearchGate as well. So, but yeah, I'd be happy if anybody is interested or have more questions to be in touch. So it's always nice to talk and chat about all this stuff.
Wonderful. And you got your name. You're just at Mahsa Shabani on Twitter, right? So
yes, yeah,
that's good. Not many people get their actual name.
Yes.
Well, great. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll speak to you again soon.